Some people spend a lifetime searching for a place where they can finally close their eyes without fear, never realizing that destiny has already chosen it for them. Charlotte Hayes had always believed exhaustion was simply another part of surviving. Every evening, she tied on the same navy apron, greeted customers with the same warm smile, and worked the late shift at a quiet 24-hour diner just outside downtown Chicago. By the time the last customer finally left, her feet ached, her shoulders felt heavy, and all she wanted was a few hours of sleep before doing it all again the next day. The city streets were unusually quiet as she stepped outside shortly after midnight, wrapping her light jacket tightly against the cool autumn breeze. Her bus had already departed, leaving her with a 30-minute walk to the small apartment she rented above an aging flower shop. Charlotte sighed softly, adjusted the strap of her worn canvas bag, and started walking beneath rows of glowing streetlights. A few blocks later, she noticed a sleek black limousine parked beside the sidewalk with its rear door standing open while the driver loaded luggage into the trunk. Believing someone had accidentally left the door unlatched, Charlotte approached with the simple intention of letting them know before continuing home. Just as she reached the vehicle, dizziness suddenly washed over her. She had skipped dinner again, worked nearly 14 hours, and barely slept the night before after helping her elderly neighbor through a medical emergency. Her vision blurred for only a second. Instinctively, she rested one hand against the open door to steady herself. Inside the spacious cabin, warm air surrounded her, carrying the faint scent of cedarwood and old leather. Without thinking clearly, she sat down for just a moment, intending only to catch her breath. Across from her sat a man dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit. His pale face appeared almost luminous beneath the soft interior lights, while long dark hair with gently curled ends rested neatly over his shoulders. His striking silver eyes quietly studied the exhausted young woman who had entered his vehicle without even noticing him. Charlotte blinked in surprise. "Oh, I am so sorry," she whispered, embarrassed beyond words. "I thought the car was empty." She tried to stand immediately, but another wave of exhaustion swept through her. The mysterious stranger calmly reached forward, offering nothing more than a folded cashmere blanket that rested beside him. "You look as though you have not slept in days," he said in a voice so steady that it somehow eased the tension inside her. Charlotte forced an apologetic smile. "I promise I am not usually this irresponsible." Instead of asking her to leave, the man simply nodded toward the opposite seat. "Sit for a moment before you continue." Charlotte hesitated. Every lesson about accepting help from strangers echoed inside her mind, yet something about him felt strangely reassuring. There was no pressure in his voice, no expectation, only quiet concern. She slowly settled back into the seat, intending to rest for no more than a minute. Outside, the driver closed the trunk, entered the front seat, and the limousine pulled smoothly away from the curb. Charlotte's eyes widened. "Wait, the car is moving." She instinctively reached for the door handle, but the stranger gently raised one hand. "The driver will stop if you wish." Charlotte looked through the window at the passing city lights, then back at the man whose calm expression never changed. Somehow, despite every sensible reason to panic, she found herself relaxing instead. The warmth inside the vehicle melted away the chill she had carried all evening. Her eyelids grew heavier with every passing block. "I just need 1 minute," she murmured softly, fighting to remain awake. The stranger quietly adjusted the blanket across her shoulders before returning his gaze to the window. Minutes later, Charlotte's head slowly leaned against him as sleep finally claimed the exhaustion she could no longer resist. She did not realize she had fallen asleep in the arms of a complete stranger. She certainly did not know that for centuries, no woman had ever found enough peace to rest beside the Vampire King, and the impossible silence filling the limousine that night would soon change the fate of an entire hidden kingdom. Charlotte did not remember dreaming. She remembered only warmth unlike anything she had experienced in years. It was the kind of quiet comfort that allowed every worry, every unpaid bill, every exhausting shift, and every lonely walk home to disappear for a little while. The limousine moved smoothly through the sleeping city, its engine barely audible beneath the gentle sound of rain beginning to fall outside. Julian Blackwood remained perfectly still, allowing the exhausted young woman to rest peacefully against him. Across the partition, The driver glanced into the rearview mirror before quickly lowering his eyes again. He had served the royal household for decades, yet he had never witnessed anything remotely similar. Every person who had ever entered the king's presence carried an invisible tension. Some became uneasy without understanding why. Others found excuses to leave within minutes. Yet the young waitress resting beside him breathed slowly and peacefully, completely unaware of the ancient power surrounding her. Several minutes later, the driver quietly spoke through the intercom. "Your Majesty, we have arrived." Julian looked toward the rain-covered windows before answering in his usual measured voice. "Wait." The driver nodded without another word. The limousine remained parked beneath the covered entrance of an elegant stone mansion hidden behind towering iron gates. Warm lights glowed through enormous windows while members of the household waited patiently beneath the entrance, none of them daring to approach without permission. Time seemed to stand still. Charlotte shifted slightly in her sleep, unconsciously pulling the cashmere blanket closer around her shoulders. For the first time in centuries, Julian found himself studying someone not because of duty, politics, or danger, but because of quiet curiosity. There was nothing extraordinary about her appearance. She wore a simple diner uniform beneath her jacket. Her shoes showed signs of long workdays. Her hands carried tiny marks left by years of honest work. Yet her face, finally free from exhaustion, reflected a peaceful trust that no one had ever shown him before. Eventually, Charlotte blinked awake. She lifted her head slowly before realizing exactly where she had been resting. Her eyes widened with complete embarrassment. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, immediately sitting upright. "I am so sorry. I cannot believe I actually fell asleep." She quickly folded the blanket with careful hands before offering it back to Julian. "You should have woken me." Julian accepted the blanket with a faint smile. "You needed the rest." Charlotte looked through the window and realized they were no longer anywhere near the neighborhood where she had entered the limousine. "I caused you so much trouble." "No," Julian answered calmly. "You caused an unexpected delay." Charlotte laughed nervously. "That sounds much more polite than saying I completely ruined your evening." To her surprise, Julian allowed the smallest hint of amusement to appear in his expression. Perhaps. The simple exchange made Charlotte feel unexpectedly comfortable again. She reached for the door handle before pausing. "Thank you for letting me stay instead of asking me to leave." Julian inclined his head. "You looked exhausted, not dangerous." Charlotte smiled warmly. "My grandmother always said the best people notice the difference." Before Julian could answer, the rear door opened from outside. An elderly but impeccably dressed gentleman respectfully bowed toward Julian before briefly noticing Charlotte inside the vehicle. Surprise flickered across his face for only an instant before it disappeared beneath perfect composure. "Everything is prepared, He stopped himself almost immediately. "Sir." Charlotte never noticed the hesitation. She climbed out of the limousine, stretched her tired shoulders, and looked up at the magnificent estate towering before her. "You must have an incredible family," she said sincerely. "Thank you again for your kindness. I hope someday someone shows you the same kindness you showed me tonight." With one grateful smile, she turned and started walking back toward the front gate, never realizing that every member of the household standing beneath the mansion entrance had remained completely motionless, silently watching the first woman in centuries leave the Vampire King with nothing more than gratitude, complete trust, and absolutely no fear. Charlotte expected never to see the mysterious gentleman again. As she walked home beneath the fading rain, she replayed the unusual encounter in her mind. Most wealthy people she had served at the diner barely looked at the waitstaff, yet the quiet stranger had spoken to her with genuine respect. He had offered nothing extravagant, only a warm blanket, a safe place to rest, and enough kindness to remind her that compassion still existed in the world. By the following evening, life had returned to its familiar rhythm. The diner buzzed with late-night customers ordering coffee, sandwiches, and slices of homemade pie, while classic jazz played softly through the speakers. Charlotte greeted every guest with her usual warm smile, moving quickly between tables despite the long hours already weighing on her shoulders. Shortly after 9 o'clock, the front door opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Dressed in the same impeccably tailored black suit, Julian entered with calm confidence, his pale face and long dark hair immediately drawing quiet attention from everyone nearby. Charlotte recognized him instantly and smiled with pleasant surprise. Carrying a menu, she approached his table. "I am glad to see you again," she said sincerely. "I promise I will stay awake this time." Julian looked up, and for the first time in many years, the smallest genuine smile appeared before fading back into his composed expression. "I appreciate your confidence." Charlotte laughed softly before placing a glass of water on the table. "You saved me from one of the most embarrassing moments of my life. Dinner is on me tonight." Julian looked at her with quiet curiosity. "You would pay for a stranger's meal?" She shrugged naturally. "You helped me when you did not have to. It seems fair." Before Julian could answer, the restaurant manager hurried toward the table with obvious concern. "Charlotte," he whispered, "that customer is sitting in the private reservation section." Charlotte looked around in confusion. No one reserved it tonight. The manager hesitated before quietly stepping back after Julian gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Charlotte never noticed the silent exchange. To her, he was simply another customer who preferred a quiet corner. As she took his order, she found his choices surprisingly ordinary. Fresh coffee, grilled chicken, vegetables, and warm bread. "No dessert?" she asked playfully. "Not tonight," Julian replied. Throughout the evening, Charlotte checked on him several times, treating him exactly as she treated every other guest. She asked whether the coffee was still hot enough, refilled his glass without being asked, and recommended the apple pie because it had just come out of the oven. None of her actions carried the slightest trace of fear, admiration, or expectation. She simply enjoyed making people feel welcome. Julian observed every small gesture with growing fascination. For centuries, almost everyone who learned his identity sought power, influence, or favor. Charlotte sought nothing at all. Near closing time, an elderly customer accidentally dropped several grocery bags near the entrance. Before anyone else reacted, Charlotte hurried over to help gather the scattered items, smiling reassuringly as she carefully packed everything back into the bags. Julian watched the scene in thoughtful silence. Her kindness was not something she offered only when convenient. It was simply who she was. As Charlotte returned to his table, slightly out of breath, she apologized for keeping him waiting. Julian slowly stood and placed enough cash on the table to cover the meal and a generous tip. "Thank you for dinner," he said quietly. Charlotte smiled. "You do not have to thank me twice." She had no idea that outside the diner, two elegant black vehicles had already arrived. Several impeccably dressed men remained respectfully beside them, waiting in absolute silence for Julian to leave, while passing pedestrians instinctively gave the mysterious group a wide berth without understanding why. Charlotte noticed only that her quiet customer seemed surprisingly important, never imagining that an entire hidden kingdom patiently waited each night for its king to finish an ordinary dinner with the only woman who had ever treated him as simply another man. The following week, Julian became an unexpected part of Charlotte's ordinary routine. He never arrived at exactly the same hour, yet somehow he always appeared during her evening shift, choosing the quiet table by the window where he could watch the city lights without attracting attention. Charlotte gradually stopped thinking of him as the mysterious stranger from the limousine. Instead, she began seeing him as someone who simply appreciated peaceful conversations after long days. Every visit followed the same comfortable rhythm. She poured his coffee before he asked, remembered that he preferred warm bread instead of fries, and occasionally convinced him to try a slice of homemade pie even though he always claimed he was not interested in dessert. Julian found the predictability surprisingly comforting. His world was filled with endless responsibilities, confidential meetings, and decisions affecting countless lives. Yet inside the small neighborhood diner, none of those burdens seemed to exist. Charlotte never asked about his wealth, his elegant car, or the impeccably dressed people who occasionally waited outside. She simply asked whether he had eaten enough and whether he had been working too hard. One rainy evening, the diner unexpectedly lost power for several minutes after a thunderstorm swept across the city. The room fell into darkness except for the soft glow of emergency lights near the exits. Several customers sighed with disappointment, while others reached for their phones to use as flashlights. Without hesitation, Charlotte moved through the dining room, carrying a tray of battery-powered candles usually reserved for emergencies. She placed one on every occupied table, smiling warmly at each guest. "Dinner always tastes better with candlelight anyway," she joked. Gentle laughter quickly replaced the frustration inside the restaurant. Julian quietly watched her transform an inconvenience into something unexpectedly pleasant. Even in darkness, she instinctively searched for ways to make other people feel comfortable. When the lights finally returned, the elderly couple sitting near the front window thanked Charlotte for making the evening memorable instead of stressful. She simply smiled and returned to work without expecting recognition. As closing time approached, Julian prepared to leave as usual. Before he reached the entrance, Charlotte hurried after him holding a neatly folded umbrella. "You forgot this the other night," she said. Julian looked at the umbrella with mild surprise. It was not his. Charlotte laughed softly. "Then someone else forgot it, but you are always walking home in the rain without one. You should keep it." Julian accepted the inexpensive blue umbrella with genuine appreciation. No one had ever offered him such an ordinary gift simply out of concern. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Please bring it back whenever you have time," Charlotte replied with a smile. "Or do not. I only wanted to make sure you stayed dry." Outside the diner, Julian paused beneath the awning before opening the umbrella. Several members of his royal security detail waited discreetly beside the familiar black limousine, pretending to study the quiet street. One of them stepped forward respectfully. "Your Majesty, the council requests your presence immediately." Julian glanced back through the restaurant window where Charlotte was wiping tables while quietly humming to herself, completely unaware that an ancient kingdom continued waiting for the man she believed was only another customer. "They will wait," Julian answered calmly. The guard hesitated before lowering his head. "They may not be pleased." Julian looked once more toward the warm lights inside the diner. "That is their decision." As the limousine disappeared into the rainy night, Charlotte placed the empty coffee cup Julian had used into the sink, smiling to herself without understanding why the restaurant always felt a little quieter after he left. While far beyond the ordinary world, powerful voices had already begun questioning why their king seemed increasingly drawn to a human woman who knew nothing about the crown he carried. The invitation arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a thick cream-colored envelope that looked far too elegant for Charlotte's tiny mailbox. She stared at the unfamiliar wax seal before carefully opening it inside her apartment. The message was brief, politely requesting her presence at a private charity dinner hosted by the Blackwood Foundation to honor several local volunteers who had quietly helped their communities throughout the year. Charlotte blinked in surprise. She had never attended a formal event in her life. After reading the letter 3 times, she finally laughed to herself. There had to be some mistake. Still, curiosity persuaded her to accept. 2 evenings later, a polished black sedan arrived outside the flower shop exactly at 6 o'clock. The courteous driver greeted her by name and escorted her toward a magnificent estate unlike anything she had ever imagined. As the vehicle passed through towering iron gates, Charlotte admired the perfectly trimmed gardens, marble fountains, and ancient stone architecture glowing beneath hundreds of warm lights. The mansion looked less like a private residence and more like something preserved from another century. "Who actually lives here?" she asked with quiet amazement. The driver offered only a respectful smile. "Someone who values tradition." Charlotte nodded, assuming she was visiting an influential family with generations of history behind them. Inside, every hallway displayed remarkable paintings, towering bookshelves, and intricate carvings unlike anything she had seen before. She noticed the staff moving with extraordinary discipline. They spoke softly, stood perfectly straight, and treated every task with almost ceremonial precision. Yet despite the formal atmosphere, each employee welcomed her with genuine courtesy. None of them made her feel out of place. An elegant woman offered to take her coat before leading her toward an enormous reception hall where guests quietly conversed beneath glittering crystal chandeliers. Charlotte recognized several local business leaders from newspaper articles, along with professors, philanthropists, and city officials. Suddenly, she spotted Julian standing near one of the tall windows, dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit that somehow seemed even more distinguished than usual. His silver eyes brightened almost imperceptibly when he noticed her approaching. "You never mentioned this foundation belonged to you," Charlotte said with a smile. Julian answered calmly. "There are many things I rarely mention." She laughed softly. "I suppose successful people become accustomed to keeping busy." Before he could reply, Conversations throughout the hall gradually faded into complete silence. Charlotte turned toward the entrance, expecting an important guest to arrive. Instead, every employee she had seen throughout the mansion simultaneously straightened their posture. Several distinguished visitors respectfully lowered their heads. Others stepped aside without a word, creating a clear path across the marble floor. Charlotte looked around in confusion. No one appeared frightened. They simply carried themselves with profound respect, as though responding to a tradition much older than the building itself. She glanced back at Julian and noticed something she had somehow overlooked every previous evening. No one approached him casually. No one interrupted him. Every member of the household waited patiently for the smallest acknowledgement before speaking. Even the elderly gentleman she had briefly met beside the limousine weeks earlier stood several steps behind Julian with quiet deference. Charlotte tilted her head, puzzled by the unusual atmosphere. "Does everyone here always act like this around you?" she asked innocently. Julian remained silent for a brief moment before answering. "They have their reasons." Before Charlotte could ask another question, the massive carved doors at the far end of the hall slowly opened. A line of distinguished men and women entered wearing formal black attire marked with an unfamiliar silver crest. The instant they saw Julian, every one of them stopped walking at exactly the same moment. Then, in perfect unison, they lowered themselves into a respectful kneel. Charlotte's smile slowly disappeared as confusion replaced every ordinary explanation she had been holding on to, and before anyone spoke a single word, she realized she had just stepped into a world she did not understand at all. Charlotte remained frozen as the grand hall fell into complete silence. The men and women kneeling across the polished marble floor never lifted their eyes. Their movements had been so perfectly synchronized that they looked less like guests attending a charity event and more like members of an ancient tradition carried across countless generations. Charlotte instinctively looked toward Julian, expecting him to appear just as surprised as she was. Instead, he stood with the same calm expression she had come to know at the diner, his posture relaxed yet unmistakably dignified. One distinguished gentleman with silver hair slowly rose from his respectful kneel before speaking in a clear voice that echoed through the enormous chamber. "Your Majesty, the Royal Council has assembled as requested." Charlotte blinked several times, convinced she had misunderstood. "Your Majesty." The words lingered in the air long after they were spoken. She looked around the room, waiting for someone else to enter through another doorway, but every face remained directed toward Julian alone. The realization settled gently rather than all at once, leaving her more confused than frightened. Julian turned toward her before quietly saying, "Charlotte, there is something I should have explained much sooner." She searched his familiar face, trying to connect the quiet man who enjoyed homemade apple pie with the impossible scene unfolding before her. "You are the one they were waiting for," she whispered. Julian gave a single nod. Before Charlotte could gather another question, a woman wearing an elegant black gown stepped forward from the council. Her silver crest matched those worn by the others. "For centuries," she said respectfully, "our king has carried an ancient presence that no ordinary visitor could endure for long. Even without knowing who he truly was, every guest eventually became uneasy, restless, or overwhelmed. None remained peacefully beside him." Charlotte looked back at Julian with growing disbelief. "But I fell asleep." A quiet murmur spread through the council chamber before fading once more. The elderly gentleman who had greeted Julian outside the limousine weeks earlier spoke next. "You did far more than fall asleep, Miss Hayes. You rested peacefully beside His Majesty for hours. That has never happened in living memory." Charlotte slowly shook her head. "There has to be another explanation. I was simply exhausted after work." "Perhaps," Julian answered softly, "but exhaustion has never silenced what others always feel in my presence." Charlotte remembered every moment they had spent together. The limousine, the diner, the umbrella, the quiet conversations after long shifts. She had never sensed anything frightening. She had simply seen a thoughtful man who listened more than he spoke. One council member finally broke the silence with visible concern. "Your Majesty, allowing a human this close to the throne changes everything. Our oldest records contain no precedent." Another added, "If word spreads beyond these walls, centuries of balance could be placed at risk." Charlotte immediately took a small step backward. I did not mean to interfere with anything, she said sincerely. If my being here causes problems, I can leave. Julian answered before anyone else could speak. You have caused no harm. His calm voice carried effortlessly through the chamber. She accepted my company before knowing my name, my position, or my responsibilities. She asked nothing of me except whether I had eaten enough and whether I remembered my umbrella. That honesty deserves respect, not suspicion. The council members exchanged thoughtful glances. Some appeared uncertain. Others seemed quietly moved by his words. Charlotte looked around the magnificent hall one more time, realizing that every strange coincidence during the past several weeks had been connected all along. The elegant cars, the disciplined household, the respectful staff, the mysterious interruptions, and the remarkable silence that followed Julian wherever he went were no longer mysteries. They were pieces of a hidden world. She had unknowingly stepped into the night, she had climbed into the wrong limousine, and deep within the ancient council, one unanswered question now weighed more heavily than any other. If the king's presence had never allowed another heart to rest in peace, why had hers felt completely at home from the very beginning? The silence inside the grand hall seemed to stretch endlessly as every pair of eyes remained fixed upon Charlotte. She had spent her entire life avoiding attention, believing that ordinary people should quietly do their work, pay their bills, and stay out of trouble. Now she stood at the center of a room filled with people whose traditions reached back farther than she could imagine. Her first instinct was still the same as it had always been. She took another small step backward. I really think I should leave, she said gently. I never intended to become part of any of this. Before she could turn toward the entrance, Julian calmly stepped beside her. He did not block her path or ask her to stay. He simply stood there, his quiet presence somehow making the enormous hall feel less overwhelming. If you wish to leave, he said softly, no one here will stop you. Charlotte looked into his familiar silver eyes. They were exactly the same eyes that had watched over her while she slept, the same eyes that had smiled ever so slightly across a diner table, and the same eyes that had thanked her for lending him an inexpensive umbrella. The title everyone else used had changed nothing about the man standing before her. She slowly released the anxious breath she had been holding. May I ask you something? Julian nodded. Of course. Charlotte looked around the magnificent chamber before returning her attention to him. When we first met, why did you never tell me who you were? Julian answered without hesitation. Because I wanted one honest conversation. His words settled over the room with surprising weight. For centuries, he continued, every introduction has begun with my position. Respect arrived before understanding. Fear arrived before friendship. You were the first person to speak to me without either. Several council members lowered their eyes in thoughtful silence. An elderly councilwoman finally stepped forward. Miss Hayes, she said respectfully, surely you understand that our concern is not personal. Our king has protected our people for generations. Anything that has never happened before demands careful consideration. Charlotte nodded politely. I understand being careful. She paused before adding with complete sincerity, but I do not understand being afraid of someone simply because everyone else expects you to be. The words echoed through the chamber. No one interrupted her. She looked toward the assembled council members one by one. Every time I met Julian, he treated me with kindness. He never asked for anything. He never tried to impress me. He simply listened. If I had known he was your king, I probably would have been nervous too. But because I did not know, I only saw the person standing in front of me. A quiet murmur spread through the gathering. Several younger members exchanged thoughtful glances, while others remained uncertain. One council member finally spoke. Your Majesty, perhaps that is precisely the problem. She sees only the man, not the burden he carries. Julian answered before Charlotte could respond. Perhaps that is precisely why her judgment remains clear. His voice was calm but unwavering. She has measured my character rather than my title. Charlotte felt herself unexpectedly smiling. Where I come from, she said softly. People do not become good because they are important. They become important because they choose to be good. The hall fell completely silent once more. Even the oldest council members seemed unable to dismiss her simple words. They carried none of the polished language expected in royal discussions, only the quiet honesty of someone who had spent her life judging people by everyday actions instead of appearances. At that moment, several attendants hurried quietly toward the council entrance before stopping respectfully beside the elderly gentleman who served Julian. After listening carefully, his composed expression changed almost imperceptibly. He immediately stepped forward and bowed. "Your Majesty," he said gravely, "our investigators have uncovered new information. It appears someone has been carefully arranging recent events around Miss Hayes long before she ever entered your limousine." A ripple of astonishment swept through the ancient chamber as Charlotte's peaceful chance encounter suddenly began to look far less accidental than anyone had believed. Charlotte stared at the messenger in stunned silence. The words echoed through the chamber with unsettling clarity. Someone had been arranging recent events around her. She instinctively shook her head. "That cannot be true," she said quietly. "My life is not important enough for anyone to plan." The elderly investigator respectfully unfolded a worn leather folder before addressing the council. "Miss Hayes, we believed the same until we compared several independent reports. Your schedule changed repeatedly over the past month because anonymous donations covered medical expenses for your elderly neighbor, forcing you to work different shifts. Your usual bus route was unexpectedly canceled on the exact evening Your Majesty's vehicle stopped outside the diner district. Even the charity committee that selected local volunteers received an unsigned recommendation highlighting your years of community service." Charlotte searched her memory. Every detail was true, yet she had accepted each event as nothing more than coincidence. Julian's expression remained composed, but his silver eyes sharpened with quiet determination. "Who submitted the recommendation?" he asked. "The signature was forged," the investigator replied. "However, our archives traced the seal used on the envelope to a private collection once belonging to a former royal advisor who disappeared decades ago." A murmur spread across the council. Several members exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing the significance immediately. Charlotte felt more confused than frightened. "Why would anyone do all of this?" she asked. One council elder answered carefully. "Because if someone wished to influence our king, they would first need someone capable of reaching him without raising suspicion." Charlotte immediately looked toward Julian. "You cannot honestly believe I was sent here on purpose." "No," Julian answered without hesitation. "I believe someone hoped to place you near me. That is very different." His calm certainty caught everyone's attention. "There is no evidence that Charlotte knew anything about these events," he continued. "Everything I have witnessed tells me she acted only according to her own character." Several council members slowly nodded. They had observed her throughout the evening. Her confusion could not be manufactured so naturally. One younger council member finally spoke. "Then whoever arranged these circumstances misunderstood the most important detail." "Which is?" another elder asked. The young councilman looked toward Charlotte. Kindness cannot be instructed. If she had approached His Majesty with hidden intentions, he would have recognized it immediately. Charlotte lowered her eyes, still trying to understand how her ordinary life had become connected to ancient secrets. "I wish none of this had happened," she admitted softly. "I only wanted to serve coffee, help my neighbors, and pay my rent on time." Julian smiled gently. "That is precisely why none of this changed who you are." The investigator continued his report. "Our search uncovered one final detail. Every attempt to manipulate the situation depended upon chance. No document could force Miss Hayes to enter the limousine. No plan could make her trust His Majesty. No arrangement could make her fall asleep peacefully beside him. Those moments belonged entirely to her own choices." Silence returned to the hall. The distinction changed everything. Whatever hidden hand had arranged circumstances, it had failed to control the outcome that mattered most. Charlotte's trust had never been planned. It had been freely given. An elderly councilwoman slowly rose from her seat before addressing the gathering. "For generations we believed strength protected this kingdom above all else. Tonight we have witnessed something different. A human heart, untouched by ambition or fear, accomplished what centuries of authority never could." One by one, several council members inclined their heads in thoughtful agreement. Suspicion gradually gave way to quiet respect. Julian stepped forward until he stood beside Charlotte once again. "The investigation will continue," he said calmly. "But no one will hold her responsible for another person's deception." His voice carried unquestioned authority. "If there is an enemy, we will face that truth together. We will not create another one by doubting the innocent." For the first time since entering the ancient hall, Charlotte felt the invisible weight surrounding the room begin to lift, while beyond the mansion walls, the unknown architect of the carefully arranged coincidences quietly realized that the greatest part of the plan had already failed, because compassion had united people who had been expected to distrust one another. Morning sunlight spread gently across the gardens surrounding the ancient estate as Charlotte stood beside one of the marble fountains, still struggling to believe that the extraordinary events of the previous evening had truly happened. The world beyond the gates continued exactly as it always had. People hurried to work. Traffic filled the streets. Coffee shops opened their doors. Yet hidden behind centuries-old stone walls, an entire kingdom had quietly changed. The royal council gathered once more inside the grand hall, not to argue, but to reach a decision. Julian entered with his usual calm dignity, and every council member respectfully rose to acknowledge him. Charlotte remained near the entrance, uncertain whether she even belonged there anymore. She had already decided that once the meeting ended, she would thank everyone for their kindness and return to her ordinary life. Before she could excuse herself, Julian turned toward the assembled council. For generations, he began, our people have believed that fear was the natural response to power. We accepted that belief because it had never been challenged. His silver eyes briefly met Charlotte's. Now it has. Complete silence filled the chamber. Charlotte Hayes asked nothing from this kingdom. Julian continued. She did not seek influence, privilege, or recognition. She judged me only by my actions, long before she knew my name or my responsibility. That honesty deserves our gratitude. Several council elders slowly inclined their heads in agreement. The elderly councilwoman who had spoken the previous evening stepped forward carrying a beautifully crafted silver medallion suspended from a deep blue ribbon. Miss Hayes, she said warmly, this honor has existed for centuries, but has almost never been presented to someone outside our people. Today, the council offers you the protection of the crown. Wherever this symbol is recognized, every member of our kingdom will regard you as a trusted friend under royal protection. Charlotte looked at the medallion in genuine surprise. I do not know if I deserve something like that. The elderly woman smiled kindly. You earned it before any of us realized what you had done. Julian personally placed the ribbon gently around Charlotte's neck. There was no ceremony beyond that simple gesture, yet everyone present understood its meaning. She was not being elevated above anyone. She was being welcomed because of the quiet goodness she had carried with her long before entering their hidden world. A soft ripple of respectful applause spread through the chamber. Charlotte looked around the magnificent hall before smiling with quiet humility. Thank you, she said sincerely. But tomorrow I still have my evening shift at the diner. Gentle laughter echoed throughout the room, breaking centuries of solemn tradition with unexpected warmth. Even several of the oldest council members found themselves smiling. Julian looked at her with unmistakable admiration. Then I suppose I know where I will be having dinner. Charlotte laughed. Only if you promise to finally try the apple pie. I believe, Julian replied. That promise is long overdue. Later that evening, customers once again filled the little neighborhood diner. Charlotte tied on her familiar navy apron, greeted every guest with the same welcoming smile, and carried fresh coffee from table to table exactly as she always had. Near the window, Julian quietly took his usual seat. Nothing about him appeared different to anyone else. He was simply another polite customer enjoying a peaceful evening meal. Charlotte placed a slice of warm apple pie in front of him before he could object. No excuses this time, she said with a smile. Julian accepted the plate without protest. Outside, the city continued its ordinary rhythm, completely unaware that a vampire king had discovered something more powerful than ancient authority. He had discovered a heart that never bowed before titles because it had always recognized kindness first. And within the quiet warmth of an ordinary diner, both their worlds moved forward together, proving that even the oldest kingdoms can be transformed when someone chooses compassion over fear, because sometimes the safest place in the world is not protected by walls or crowns, but by the simple trust shared between two honest hearts.